Madam President and Madam President-elect. Thank you. Hopefully, before long, we'll be able to address that form of inequality more broadly. There are seats at the front for anyone standing if you want to come up. No need to be shy. I'll walk around, so we'll get a chance to talk to everyone. But there's about 8 seats down here if sincerely anyone wants to come. Otherwise, I'll bite the people down here to justify you staying at the back. I want to start by asking, please, a question of everyone. And I want to just poll the room. And I'm going to ask you to vote on a scale of 0 to 10. And the question is, how well do you think the world is doing in tackling inequality? If you think it's awesome, we've cracked this one, done deal, 10. You think this is the greatest debacle of all time, we're in meltdown, 0. And if you're somewhere in between, it's a 5. And on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 is the worst debacle ever, 10 is the greatest solution and salvation is near. Where do you stand, just in the room? Like everyone to share their opinion. This is participatory polling. Great. Everyone, so we have a lot of low scores, 2s, 4s, we have a 0, we have a 8. Any 10s? Who's above 5, just by show of hands? Handful. Who is below 5? That's the room. Okay. I just want to get us uplifted. You know, we're doing well. So, now I want you to just grab the person next to you, and I want you to pick one word to describe why you gave that score. One word. When I say go, grab the person next to you and just each share back and forth one word to justify your score. Go. Okay. One word. Now, I'm always reminded in a university environment that whenever we ask professors to give one word, we get a little more. Students aren't too far behind. But out of curiosity, now just to canvass the room, what's a word that your partner said to justify their score? Any volunteers? Yeah. Discrimination. And what was the score you gave to go with that? You want to clarify? Yeah.
No, I fully agree.
Yeah, but did you give a number at the beginning when we 0 to 10?
Yeah, I gave 2.
2. So discrimination and 2. Okay. Any others? No. Your partner said capitalism, and what number did she give?
She gave
3. Okay. Let's go from anyone in the back? Yeah. Health. And what was the number that went with it? 4. Yeah? And which number? 3.
My partner said income and gave 3.
3?
Women and 3.
Okay. Any high scores? Before we all, have to see a clinician in the School of Social Work? Any high scores? Oh, yeah.
Effort was the word.
Effort, 7. Okay. So this is a very difficult issue. And I would say the range of perspectives here is roughly consistent with the global zeitgeist right now. In my own work in international policy discussions, inequality feels like issue number 1. In the United States, in my opinion, everyone has their own, I live in this country, I think that it's almost a multi-generational shift in the ability to have the discussion about inequality. It's very uncommon. This was the one country where that topic actually wasn't even discussed so much, but now with the 1% movement and so forth, it's become more of a front burner, if not solved. But there's also a lot of good things that have been happening in the world. And as much as we're worried about this, it's also very confusing, because we sense that there are some good things happening, but we also have this deep sense of malaise and concern. And that's a tension that I want to talk about today. And that's really a theme that I want to talk about in terms of how those forces collide and what to do about it. So I want to start by taking us back. Imagine it's still 1999. Were any of you not born then? I'm not that old, but I date myself. Okay, good. So that's a good start. 1999. Just take a moment, think back. Those of you who are maybe in the senior side of the room might have been working, professors. Some of you might have been in elementary school. A big range in this room. But before the turn of the century, I just want you to think about that. Now, in full disclosure, I have friends. If I say 1999, they think of the Prince song. I'm going to party like it's 1999. So I just want to surface that for any of you who have that thought. And that will not be the younger crowd most of the time. It's one of his greatest hits. But I want to talk about, that song actually came out in 1982. But I want to talk about what was going on in the world at that time, which was quite different. This is a photo from the cover of Time magazine at the so-called Battle in Seattle. This was the anti-globalization protest after the Asia crisis in 1997-98. The US government basically went in with a bunch of policy mandates through the IMF and otherwise and put the strictures on Asia, which is really important to understanding why Asia decided, the Asian economies, to save a lot of money in their foreign reserves and why that affected the economic crisis of 2008. But that said, the protests were so strong in 1999 at the World Trade Organization's ministerial meeting that the WTO actually had to stop its proceedings. Actually had to cancel their meetings. And this was when the tech bubble was taking off. The sense of injustice and inequality was, I would say, even more globally palpable, if not in this country. In the rest of the world, it certainly was. And the sense of injustice was profound and deep, and globalization wasn't even clear whether it was a good word or a bad word. And that was the hot topic of the debate of the day. Is globalization good or bad? Who's winning and losing? Aid at the time, this was less than a decade after the end of the Cold War. This is just 3 countries for illustration. The red is Canada, green is UK, blue is US. Aid, foreign aid efforts, which is a measure of global effort of the rich countries, was on a secular down trend. Most people don't know. Who knows when US foreign aid hit its lowest point of all time? Any guesses? You have a hint here. 1997, under President Bill Clinton. Most people don't know that. 0.09% of national income. After the Cold War, people were happy to focus at home. The world was getting better. And these support systems, such as they were, sometimes good, sometimes bad, were getting pulled back. And the general view was that the poorest people in the world were getting left behind. This is a photo of I took in northern Ethiopia, in Tigray province, one of the most excluded places on the planet. You want disconnected? This is the ultimate in disconnection. And they're girls, so they're the ultimate of the disconnectees, historically. And then something interesting happened. In September of 2000, the largest ever gathering of world leaders came together at the United Nations, something called the Millennium Summit. Kofi Annan was Secretary General, And here you see, it's a bit small. You see Kofi Annan there, President Clinton, Mitterrand, Tony Blair, Jiang Zemin. Some of these guys have changed. Vladimir Putin has not. You see Suharto, you see Obasanjo, President of Nigeria. You know, this was world leaders. You can pick your world leaders there. I'm Canadian, my Prime Minister, I got up here, Jean Chrétien. You know, different era. It was the largest ever gathering of world leaders, and they set something called the Millennium Declaration. And in that declaration, they said, well, let's take advantage of this turn of the millennium to tackle this issue of globalization, the role of the UN. And they had a paragraph in there where they said to tackle the most abject and dehumanizing forms of extreme poverty to which more than 1 billion people are currently subjected. Now, at one level, that's nice, good words. But at another level, they did something more important, was that they really drew together the discussion that the international community had been having to not just talk about ambition, but metrics. So these are the symbols for the 8 main Millennium Development Goals. Now, out of curiosity, can anyone in this room name the 8 Millennium Development Goals? No. One? Yeah? This is, I'll run through them super quickly. This is hunger and poverty. This is education. Gender equality, education, gender equality, child health, maternal health, infectious disease, environment, and global partnership. Now, these are just symbols that were made actually years later by a Brazilian group to capture this. Because, not unlike this room, most people didn't know that this had happened. And in most of the world, general publics do not get out of bed every day talking about the Millennium Development Goals. And what I want to submit to you is that I believe these have been one of the most important, if not the most important set of agreements ever to come out of the United Nations, for sure. But they've helped to change the course of humanity. How? Why? There are a lot of complexities to the story of the world and the 5 or 6 billion odd people living in the developing world. So from the very beginning, I want to be clear that none of this can be oversimplified. Anyone who tells you a single answer to how's the world done on extreme poverty, how's the world done on the Millennium Development Goals, is this a success or a failure, probably doesn't understand the question. But I do want to tell you about one story which I lived through, which is the story of global AIDS treatment. Because for me, this story is most emblematic of how these pieces fit together, can fit together, when done right. When I started in this business, so to speak, at the interface between academia and policy and practice, it was roughly the turn of the millennium. And there were about 25 million people infected with HIV around the world, best estimate. We now have a better estimate, but it was 1 to 2 million people dying every year from the disease. By the way, that range tells you how much attention was being paid. What's a million here or there? And do you know how many people the international community was supporting to get AIDS treatment as that was happening? 0. No one. The time most of the pandemic was striking Africa, the vast majority of the infections were there. You had life expectancy plummeting in many countries. Often the teachers, the doctors, the nurses of society. You had this incredible mass death and no effort anywhere. Now, roughly 1996, antiretrovirals had come on the market. And antiretrovirals were the breakthrough medicine that allowed AIDS patients to receive something other than a death sentence and to receive treatment. And scaled up very quickly in the rich countries. But at the time, it was considered technically too difficult to deliver in the poor countries. And this is a graph of the number of people on antiretrovirals just in the beginning of the decade, 2000, 1, 2, 3. And those are millions. And so 2000, 2001, you had 10,000 here. It doesn't really show up, but then you're getting into the hundreds of thousands. In 2001, Kofi Annan, working with Jeff Sachs, Paul Farmer, many others, launched the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, Malaria. In January 2003, great surprise to many people, President Bush launched the US Presidential Emergency Program for AIDS Relief in his State of the Union speech. And at that time, this is by the end of 2003, there was almost 500,000 people on treatment. Out of, at the time, the estimate, 6 million people who needed it. So it had gone, and one of the interesting things was in spring of 2001, the head at the time of the US Agency for International Development publicly stated, with all due respect, these people in Africa can't tell Western time. They'll never be able to follow a drug regimen. Triple combination therapy is too hard. And there were many arguments being made in the technocrats that if you tried, that would lead to drug resistance. Therefore, it's better not to try. So focus on prevention instead. This sounds too impossible to be true. That was the conventional wisdom that people took for granted. Now, a handful of people, and I mentioned some of them already, said that's ridiculous. And then a couple things happened. And in 2003, perhaps the most influential anthropologist in the world today, Jim Kim, president of the World Bank, one of my favorite people on the planet, he was head of the World Health Organization's AIDS division. He'd taken leave from Harvard at the time. And of course, Jim had worked with Paul Farmer to launch Partners in Health, Central Plateau of Haiti. Many of you know the story. But Jim went to WHO and he said, and he'd been very involved with the Millennium Goals, and he said, why don't we at least launch a program to get half the people who need it on treatment by 2005? And at the time, the estimate was 6 million that needed it, so let's get it to 3. So they called it 3 by 5. Now that was consistent with the Millennium Goals, which actually said, let's at least cut extreme poverty by half in its many forms. We talked about those 8 goals by 2015. And so they set this target basically without permission from the international community. They just said, let's go for it. And in the face of tremendous resistance from the powers that be, who felt unconsulted in setting this ridiculous target that would just set us up for failure and therefore lose support. So what happened? This is coverage. The blue bars are by the end of 2005. They failed. They got to about 1.4 million people by the end of 2005. Now, is that a success or a failure? If you were to read, I'd submit to you, a typical newspaper headline, it would be something along the lines of, UN fails again, World Health Organization can't even meet half of its target, and only got to 1.4 million. My headline would be one of the greatest successes in history. Why? Because what Jim was trying to do, and many of his collaborators, huge network around the world, so it's not to single out one person, but what he did was pivotal, was he wanted to force people to think about reaching targets of people in need at scale. And they were tracking every 6 months the coverage targets. And the US program was focused on coverage targets, and the Global Fund was focused on coverage targets. And you know what happened? How many people are on AIDS treatment today? 8 million. In the course of learning by doing, they realized it's not 6 million people who need it, probably much closer to 15 million people. And actually adjusted the protocols for the health practitioners in here around CD4 counts, where they realized it was better to start treatment earlier, and therefore more people need it. And we're actually en route to getting universal coverage. back here it was impossible. Back here it was a failure. Back here, or up here, oh, that's what we meant to do all along. And that's the way we think about things. These hard-fought victories, it's like Kennedy's famous line, every success has many parents, every failure is an orphan. A lot of people responsible for this success, I can tell you. But we're not there yet. But it shows how when you think about things differently and then act around them differently, you start to achieve things differently. But there's been a broader evolution on global inequality. That's one story. I would say it's actually one of the, again, most profound because it took a problem that was considered just too hard to solve and developed extraordinary systems to deal with them. What about income? This is the headline measure of global inequality usually. This is a graph, just to explain, I'm sorry if it's hard to see in the back. This is multiples of North American, or pardon me, this is the North American income as a multiple of the local income. So just to translate that, the red is South Asia. That means in 1980, North American income per capita was 30 times South Asia's. And it's come down tremendously to a little under 15 times. So these are what economists would call convergence trends, decreasing geographic inequality. You see Latin America and the Caribbean not doing so well, worsening, and then since the early 2000s getting better. East Asia, driven hugely by China, getting better throughout. And Africa, getting worse and worse and worse and worse, around the turn of the decade, starts to get better. So a great turnaround. Now those are average incomes. So that's just a part of the story. But there is a very different story in terms of the global economy than there was 10 years ago in 1999, or 14 years ago now. And one of the most interesting things, my colleague Andy Sumner, who's now in London, has defined it as the new bottom billion. This is the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day, the so-called dollar a day extreme poverty measure. And you see in 1990, by Andy's estimates, it was about 1.7 billion people. And by 2007, it's about 1.25. It's come down dramatically. But interestingly, the orange, I'm sorry, got cut off here. The orange is the low-income countries, and the blue is the middle-income countries. And in 1990, 95% of the world's poorest people lived in the world's poorest countries. That's actually changed. Not only has the number of poor people decreased, but 75% of them roughly, and there's all sorts of debates on the exact numbers, so I don't want to focus on those, live in so-called middle-income countries now. That's Indonesia, that's Nigeria, that's Ghana, that's India. These countries have seen enough average progress that average incomes have been growing, so the economy is considered differently, but there's still a lot of these poor people. That's a good story and a bad story when we talk about inequality. It's a good story because it's saying that these countries are now doing better and better and they can pay for services themselves. They have increasing capacity to take care of their own poor and responsibility. When you're a low-income country, it's really, you can't actually afford AIDS treatment. The math doesn't work if you have a high disease burden. When you're a middle-income country, you can, generally speaking. But if you're a middle-income country, that means averages are going up, but you still have a huge number of people living in extreme poverty. So your inequality within the country might well be growing. And that's the challenge you see around much of Asia today. Extraordinary average growth, but still many, many people getting left behind. That's a complicated story. Now this is a graph, many of you might know Branko Milanovic, who's one of the leaders in the economics field at the World Bank and elsewhere. This is a graph of global income distribution. So the horizontal line is your percentile on the global income distribution. If you're on the right side, you're the richest person in the world. If you're on the left side, you're the poorest person in the world. And this is 20 years of income growth for each of those places on the distribution. the so-called reclining S-curve. Again, not a simple story. Branko simplifies this as China's middle class had basically 80% growth, doing very well. Much of humanity, thank you very much. Extraordinary rate of progress. If you're the US middle class, you've not even seen 10% growth over that period. And if you're the top of the top, you're doing fine. And the bottom of the bottom, there's actually censoring issues in the data, but not doing quite as well. The poorest places aren't yet joining the party, so to speak, of global progress. Now, this is tough. There's the old joke where if you're stuck on the highway, you feel like that's okay unless both sides are moving fast beside you. Then you feel like it's unfair. And then if you see that everyone beside you looks a certain way, or they're part of a group, then you get mad because you feel like there must be some kind of exclusion or discrimination happening. And I think a lot more people feel that way because they feel like some parts of the world are doing well and their part isn't. And that might be defined by geography, that might be defined by ethnic group, that might be defined by something else. And that's a deep element of this sentiment I think we're dealing with right now globally, is that we don't feel like, oh, I lost my job, but thank goodness the averages are good. You know, you don't see a lot of that in Detroit. Well, you know, it's okay because China is doing well, so ultimately in 20 years my kid's going to get a better job because they're richer. It doesn't work that way, right? Nor would one expect it to. And this, so it's the most technical graph I'll show, but I think it's very interesting, also by Branko Milanovic. This is a mapping of global income distribution against country income distribution. So again, this is on the bottom right, that's the richest people in the country now, and the bottom left is the richest people the poorest people in the country. And then this is the richest people in the world and the poorest people in the world. And you see India, for example, is low throughout. I just lost my pointer, which some of you guys might appreciate. India is low throughout. And basically, the poorest, 90% of India, is poorer than 95% of America, which is the top line. And you see China, the red line, it's actually moving left very fast on this graph. And Brazil, the green line, almost perfectly matches the global income distribution. So if your country's distribution was the same as the world's, it would just be a diagonal line. And Brazil has incredible inequality, which matches the global inequality. But this tells you, I think tells us and underscores this really important point. Inequality feels very different depending on where you sit. There is no single answer to how the world is doing on inequality. There's roughly 7 billion answers to how the world's doing on inequality. And I think we really have to understand that, I believe, in a much deeper way. Now, I just lost my juice here, I think. That's what happened. Okay, we'll go old school. But I'm not certain that income inequality is the best way to measure progress. And I like to think about what I consider the most bottom line measure of poverty or inequality as the deepest and most important one. That's, does your child live to their 5th birthday? There's no more universal standard of human well-being that I'm aware of that's both well measured, pretty well measured, and a common value. We can argue on the value of $1. Few of us will argue on the value of our child. And what you see also, this is the same graph of convergence, but the numbers are flipped to make it consistent in a sense. So this is the multiples of each region's child mortality relative to North America's. So on the left, in 1970, Sub-Saharan Africa's child mortality was roughly 10 times the rate of North America's. And as North America's kept coming down, you see there's gradual progress, East Asia, Latin America. Sub-Saharan Africa was getting way, way worse. Massive divergence. And then, and this is part of this story again, the global health revolution of the past decade actually changed the trajectory. And it's still 15 times as high in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's pretty brutal and unconscionable and got to get fixed. But it's changed in direction. So we're even seeing convergence here, but this graph, notice, looks quite different than the income graph in terms of where countries change. And even the two biggest curves, if you will, India and China, which drive a lot of the global numbers, they changed in the late 1990s. China was actually, during the late 80s and early 90s, diverging from the US in child survival. And now they had actually an acceleration of progress during the past decade. And there's a lot of reasons why, and I want to come back to that in a second. One of the big ones is that we actually invest more in this stuff. Thank you very much. So remember I showed that graph of aid going down as a measure of dollars. So every time someone tells you aid achieves nothing, I would like you to show them the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria's budget. Because that is the explicit counterpoint. But in an organizational sense, it's more complicated than that, of course, but that's all you need to do. But there's been roughly a quadrupling of investment in global health in the past decade, from 5 billion a year to 20 billion a year. Huge change in budgets. But another part of this is an evolution in conversations, and we're in a university. This is a room filled of talented and accomplished students and professors. And I want to draw attention to the role that our communities and university communities and research communities play in being part of these conversations. I'll try this. So just going back, to that conversation, this was kind of the global conversation in 1999, 2000. You had the protests on the streets, you had the world leaders getting together for a nice conference, and you had people, real people, kind of sitting disconnected from it all. I'm still not succeeding. Okay, that's fine. No problem. So that changed, actually, in the course of this global effort around the Millennium Goals, to the point that by 2005, we now know that through a lot of campaigning, a lot of work, policy work and otherwise, we had the world's most respected political leader, Nelson Mandela, getting in front of the crowds in Wembley Stadium, saying this challenge of extreme poverty and the Millennium Goals is the calling of our time. We had millions of people gathering, not to protest, if you will, they were protesting, but to encourage the governments to do more. Not to stop things, but to do more. And that conversation has fundamentally changed the way the world works in thinking about how to tackle problems at scale. It kept spreading. This is a photo taken from the front stage of Davos, the World Economic Forum, the kind of global elite of business and politics, coveted real estate on the stage. And you have a call to action for the Millennium Development Goals. You have the new Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. You have the then President Yar'Adua of Nigeria, Africa's most populous country. You have Gordon Brown, Prime Minister, Queen Rania, Bill Gates, Bono, Peter Gabriel. Everyone's getting behind this call to action. You have the policy elites saying, we must do more. It didn't start that way, but it diffused that way. And there's an anthropology of global conversations. And there's economics that drives a part of it. But there's more, which I don't myself totally understand, although I have some hypotheses. Part of it is how it's talked about in the media, for sure. This graph shows, I just did this recently, the number of times the Millennium Development Goals in some form have even been mentioned in the New York Times. Supposedly paper of record, aspires to be for the United States. You see, these are numbers of stories. So 2002, there was one. Kofi Annan had an op-ed. 2003, 4. A lot of work was done to educate some of the journalists. The tsunami happened. There was a huge set of events, Asian tsunami in 2004. 2005, you saw 25 stories. Editorial board really got behind this. They're writing about big summits, G8 summit and all that stuff. And then back to 2006, 4 stories. So in most of these years, 5, 7, 2010, there was a big UN summit, so there was a little more attention. And then they actually started the blogs. So in fairness, people don't just read the physical newspaper anymore, they read the blogs. And so this is measuring, the yellow is the blogs that reference the goals too. And maybe not surprisingly, the more modern journalists who are blogging are writing about it more. I don't know, we'll see. But if you were to pick up the New York Times in 2011, and that was your main source of news, you might read one reference somewhere buried in the paper to the Millennium Goals every 3 months. So in that respect, it might not be surprising that everyone in the room can't recite the 8 Millennium Development Goals off by heart. This isn't necessarily a frontline public conversation, even though there's a trend, and it's growing. It's actually growing. Part of it, in my view, goes back to the research community, and what do we talk about? Because ideas have geneses. Research comes from somewhere. The journalists read things before they write about them or give an interview on them. And there's a pipeline of ideas that inform our societal debate. And so I said it'd be interesting to look at some of the journals and some of the research. This is the World Bank's policy research papers. The World Bank is the world's leading development institution. It's the best financed. It's got about 10,000 people. I would argue, and we can debate their policies, I do all the time, but generally speaking, it's the richest concentration of talent, kind of PhD measures, people focused on development in the world. A lot of people there, very smart people, so even when you disagree with them, they're smart. So this is how often the world's leading development institution, where if you went into the lobby, you would see the banners hanging for the Millennium Development Goals in the lobby. You go to the website, you'll see all about the Millennium Development Goals. Well, if you look at the research, in no year, this is percentage, did more than 4% of the research papers even mention the Millennium Development Goals. So I think it's fair to say the research departments and the researchers of thousands and thousands of papers weren't hugely focused on how to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Now, I want to be very clear. The political leadership was very committed to this. The chief economists were very committed to this. But these are big institutions. There's no question Jim Kim is deeply committed to this. Bob Zoellick was committed to it. Wolfenson was. Wolfowitz, I think, was too. But the institutions are much bigger than that. And they weren't taking these goals seriously. But I don't blame the World Bank staff. A, it's too easy. B, I don't think it's quite right. I think they have responsibilities which they need to adhere to better. But where do they take their signals? Look at the academic economics community. These people, many of them, the majority of them are economists. So I looked at the top economics journals. How many of them reference these goals? The blue here, and forgive me, those of you who aren't in economics won't know these things, so you're sane. But this is the American Economic Review and the Journal of Political Economy and the Quarterly Journal of Economics, arguably the 3 most prestigious journals. And this is not percentage, this is number of articles. Here's 1. Here's 2. And then the Journal of Development Economics, arguably the lead specialty field journal, had its first mention, I want to underscore mention, not focus, on these goals in 2007. That's the green. And since then, they've had about a dozen. So any of you who are economics students, I forgive you if you haven't been reading about these as part of your coursework, because it would be hard. Right? Now, where are the economists? Well, the first counter-argument is probably, well, that's because it's a policy issue and we do the real research. We do academic stuff. There is a divide between academic and policy. There should be. Unfortunately, that doesn't hold up if you look at the big global breakthrough of the past decade in health. This is all of those economics journals, the 4 of them, added up is the blue. And then the red is the research and review articles from one journal called The Lancet. And you see it did take a little while for them to get going. And by the way, this doesn't include all the news articles and quick reviews and one-pagers and all that stuff, editorials in The Lancet, of which, if you add it all up, there's more than 1,000 articles in the past decade. But this just shows how seriously the research community takes these issues. And in my view, my hypothesis, but again, this is a question I put to the group because I think you're the ones who could help us understand this much better, is ultimately the health community is defined by a single idea. How do you save the patient's life? That's a goal. That's an outcome. And it's a bottom line metric. Economics community, and it's full of practitioners, by the way, economics community ultimately informed by a different question. What's the most efficient use of the next available dollar? It's a very important question. It doesn't tell you how to save a kid's life. It's a different question. And that's why I don't want to just beat up on the economics community. I want to underscore that for them, what's called an objective function needs to be flipped. They don't just have to figure out how to get towards doing better. They have to figure out how do we solve these problems. And that's a difference. Now, final chapter. I do think, we've talked about some of the breakthroughs in policy and real people's lives. We've talked about some of the changes in public discussion. We've talked about some of the changes or not in academic discussion. Again, in this very non-simple story of these competing forces that we talked about at the beginning, I want to talk about evolution in society, because I actually have seen perhaps the biggest change in this front, and much of it comes from the campuses, but unfortunately, faculty, it's from the students, with utmost respect. Because I think the young generation is waking up and growing up in a very different way, and a very different sense of empowerment and skills and problem solving, and we all have to take notes. Now, this is a graph of US foreign aid. We talked about lowest point of all time in 1997. This is now in billions of dollars. And you see that US aid has had a huge shift. This is for everything, by the way. This includes for Iraq, for Afghanistan. Those are, give or take $5 billion a year. It's a huge number, single biggest recipients of aid. But the health budget is actually, in my kind of superficial 30,000-foot description, the biggest driver of this change. Agriculture has now come online too. But there's a huge shift in the budgets. In one sense, if you ask normal people on the street, they'd say, well, most people presume this is like 30% of the federal budget. They want to cut it down to 10. Truly, in the Gallup polls, they don't know that it's actually only 1%. John Kerry, one of his first speeches, I think his first major speech in becoming Secretary of State was, don't think that this is the way to solve our budget problems. This is the most important investment we make. And he said, we need to protect this budget. But there's another set of trends, going back to our opening discussion. How do you conceive of this by any scale? It's roughly 0.2% of national income, so 20 cents on every $100 of income. Trivial. But 30 billion bucks is 30 billion bucks. But there is this other element of society that is changing very fast, and it goes to some of the discussions we have here. This is something I've been tracking. My former colleague Jeff Sachs pointed this out to me years ago, and I keep tracking it. This is the Wall Street bonus pool every year I don't know what's north and west and east here, but that's. But, you know, even our foreign aid budget has roughly tracked the growth of the bonus pool from one industry in one state in the past decade. And it's extraordinary how much that is and how much wealth is being accumulated in a very small segment of society. So it's just, this isn't meant to be a cheap comparison. This is meant to just put numbers in perspective. And I even just yesterday added these numbers up. This is the cumulative Wall Street bonus pool since the turn of the millennium, and all US foreign aid since the same time. They're almost the same number, about $300 billion. This excludes debt relief, which isn't actually a transfer, an accounting trick mainly. But I think that's an important juxtaposition to keep in mind when we think about these tensions of the opening question of inequality. We do have this major set of issues with major progress backed by bigger and bigger investments, even if not quite enough. But we also have this incredible plutocracy, as my friend Chrystia Freeland has dubbed it, which is an incredible stratification of wealth and even influence. Those are happening at the same time. Now, even that is not a good versus evil story alone. If you look at private giving, a lot of Americans presume, if you ask an American on the street, oh, well, our government doesn't give that much money, but we're the most generous people in the world. We give a lot of money privately. It's actually a bit of a mythology. It is. But the yellow here is private giving, according to the OECD data, and the green is that same official government giving. And you see there has been a tremendous increase in private giving in the past decade too, a tripling roughly. That's an extraordinary change. It's about 0.15% of national income. So private citizens are giving, and many of them are rich people. Now, a lot of people presume Bill Gates, right? But it's not actually. Bill Gates gives extraordinary generosity and leadership, and he and Warren Buffett. You know, the most recent year, they gave about $3 billion for global development, and they leverage it. So the multiplier on their money is extraordinary. But they give $3 billion, and it's roughly 15% of what the country's giving through private aid, if these numbers are to be believed. There is a societal change going on in terms of how we engage with the world. Now, why is that happening? How many people here have ever given a Kiva loan? Far more than know the Millennium Development Goals. They just gave their millionth lender just got a loan, or borrower, pardon me, just got a loan. This is my friend Jessica Jackley, one of the co-founders. They started this out of business school, saying, how can we use technology to engage the world and engage this growing spirit? It's really started in 2006, by the way, as part of this global zeitgeist of partnership. And they've recycled their lens, so it's about $500 million worth of loans. It's a huge contribution by some Silicon Valley kids. Lauren Bush was a fashion model who decided to get out of that business, and she's launched Feed, the co-founder Ellen Gustafson. She's one of the most thoughtful young entrepreneurs I know. And she launched Feed, and the idea is cause marketing. If you're going to sell fashion, let's at least link it to something good. So basically, every time you buy a bag, it comes with a certain number of school meals you help to provide. And so far, they've supported more than 60 million school meals through the World Food Program. Young entrepreneur. My friend Peter Thum, if you've ever bought a bottle of water at Starbucks, you've probably had Ethos Water, which he co-founded. That he moved on from. That was about, you know, supporting water projects in the developing world. He's now taken on a project. It's so amazing. It's called Fonderie 47. They melt AK-47s, and then they turn those into high-end jewelry, and they sell them at high prices to wealthy people because they want the opinion leaders of the world, those elites, to understand this issue, and then they use proceeds from that to melt more guns. And so I think the numbers, I'm not going to get exactly right, but around like 500,000 guns or some large number, and they're just getting going. Huge that they're getting going. I think this is so clever. It's like the opposite of the Live Strong yellow armband. Intentionally, because, you know, we got to get everyone to recognize this issue of small arms and need to find a creative way for them to see it every day. And it's doing good work in the meantime. And then my favorite story of this ilk is a guy named, a friend of mine, named Scott Harrison. Who's ever given to charity water? Less popular on campus than Kivo. Good. What did you give for charity water out of curiosity? Yeah, how did it come about? Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So in many parts of the world, it's interesting, so many people here have done Kiva, less charity water. In other places, it's the opposite. But this is growing, and it started around the same time again, in 2006. And Scott, do you know what his previous job was? He was a nightclub promoter in New York. And he was living the high life, and he literally reconnected with religion, and he's like, this is ridiculous. And he traveled around the world, and he said, I'm going to take on this issue of clean water. So far, I hope my memory serves me correctly, they are bringing water to 2.5 million people. And they use GPS technology, so if you give $10 and all your friends give $10, it sits in a pot, and they add it all up, and they save that money to when the well gets built. And when the well gets built, you get the email with the GPS link to that's where the well was. We've had these challenges, we've had this confusion, I would say. What's the most important thing to take on next? And I want, just as a final kind of audience poll, I want you to turn, if I could ask you to the person on your other side, and I want you to try, as disciplined as you can, to come up with the one thing that you think is most important to take on next. These Millennium Goals are coming up in 2015. Do we just stop? John gets a new job? No. This is going on. So take a moment, talk to your other partner, new partner, and think about what do you think is the one most important thing for us to take on next? Okay. All right. We can bring it back in 3, 2, 1. Thank you. So, let's get some other voices. What were some of the things that came up? If we can get some volunteers. Most important issue to take on next. Yeah, in the back. Climate change? Yep. Sorry, did you have something? Someone over here. Irrigation. Yep. Yep. Others? Pollution. Education. Corporate social responsibility, yeah. Others, yeah. Big. Any others? Yeah. Sorry, politics? In what sense? Yeah. You're a great academic. Get out there. Yeah. No, I say that in the serious way. You get it. Like getting these resources for these big questions. Yeah. Any other barnstormers? Sustainability. Environment, you mean? Yeah. I would agree with everything that's just been said. And the question then is twofold. One, how to organize ourselves around these questions as a global community. And second is how to not be hamstrung by the policy world that often has to catch up. I believe policy matters, governments matter. I'm not going to let them off the hook. But I don't want to wait for them when there's so much leadership coming off from the grassroots and the grass tops and everywhere in between. And a lot of corporates too, I would say. So there's a big high-level panel coming out of the United Nations. It's an advisor group to the Secretary General that Ban Ki-moon himself mandated. And they'll be reporting at the end of May on this question, what next? And they're going to make recommendations. It's co-chaired by UK Prime Minister David Cameron, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Nobel laureate, President of Liberia, and President Yudhoyono of Indonesia. Kind of an interesting cross-section of the world's economies. The one country that's actually delivered on its promises for global development in a new way in the past decade, UK. A new and emerging middle-income country with extraordinary complexity in its society, and a fragile state that's emerging from civil war with extraordinary poverty. And the first, of course, female head of state from Africa. Now she has one counterpart at the table from Malawi. But they're going to make recommendations. And what they're going to recommend will be a basis for global conversation. It's not the only one. There's actually been a huge global UN outreach effort on this for people to vote. You can actually go online. I think it's myworld2015.org and vote. What do you think are the priorities? But I want to put forward my suggestion for how to think about this. With some colleagues, I've called it the Zen framework. Partly because the world is really much about what happens in Asia. It's the majority of the world's population. It's the majority of the transformation of the global economy. It's the majority of the increment of pressure on the global ecosystems. And it's where many of these inequalities are taking shape in the deepest way. The Z, in my view, stands for zero extreme poverty. The blue here is actually where we've come as a share of the developing world. We've actually cut extreme poverty, dollar-a-day poverty, by half 5 years ahead of schedule. It's incredible success for a lot of different reasons, but we have. And it's on track, if it goes this way, to get pretty close to zero by 2030 on the current trend. Bono even gave a TED Talk on this. Some of you might have seen it a few weeks ago. It's online with exactly this graph. He's got better graphic designers than me, but making this exact point. Now there's a second bit. It's not just about income poverty. It's also about what I would consider the other aspects, and I just want to cite this health one again. Zero unnecessary child deaths. And this is the trajectory, the blue and the green, Africa and the developing countries. And there's technical debate, as there should be right now, about what it means to have no preventable deaths of children. The debate is somewhere around 20 to 30 per 1,000 live births. Still a very high number compared to, say, 4 or 5 in most advanced economies. But that's what the argument is. And you see that that really means acceleration of progress in Africa is needed. So each country, and I would consider that broadly the zero poverty, but then I actually think that countries need, each of them, extension goals. An epsilon goal, if you're an economist, the country level variation, to take on their national priorities, national inequalities, national social protection systems, national debates around justice. Some of those conversations are actually very hard to have globally, and in fact, they don't work globally because the societies have such different value structures. But nationally, you can set targets. But then the N is the environment. We have such incredible global scientific agreement around climate change and such an inability to solve the problem politically. It's incredible. Why? In my view, it's not because we don't know what to do. Most reasonable people will talk about putting a price on carbon, major investments in different forms of mitigation, whether that's carbon capture, sequestration, there's all sorts of arguments. But basic framework is set, and then it's about the details. The reason we haven't figured it out is that we haven't figured out how to share the cost. We haven't figured out how to share the burden of who pays for it, even if it's the cheapest investment you could make compared to the downside, which is calamitous. Maybe now that all the media heads living in Manhattan experience Hurricane Sandy, we'll have a different conversation, but I don't know, because it's actually a deep problem. And that, again, goes to this anthropology of global conversations, where it's about how do we have these conversations, how do we inform them, how do they take shape, how do we frame the trade-offs, and how do we get the groups to agree? Because as it stands right now, we can't get people to agree on how they share their future. Economics tells us a lot, but it doesn't tell us everything. And that's why I said yes to coming here, because I want to learn from you guys how we can start shaping these conversations and learning from them and understanding them and explaining them in a very different way. Anyone know what this is? Yeah. This is the global map of air connectivity. That's how interconnected our planet is among rich people who can afford to fly. It's way more connected among people with internet accounts. As of May of last year, more than half of the internet accounts in India are on mobile phones. More than half of the new internet users were in 4 countries. I call them the CHIPS economies: China, India, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The world is getting, this is like the light touch version of global connectivity. And we have to figure out in each of our societies and across our societies how we build these conversations. I can give you my thoughts, but I count myself literally as one of 7 billion. So it kind of matters, but only matters as much as every other of the 6.999999 billion. And that's the way we have to think about this. And I had the best experience the other day. I was coming out of a meeting in Senegal, and I'm like a reluctant tweeter. And I probably do it 10 times once and then don't do it for 2 weeks and then do 10 times. People tell me you should tweet more, okay. I don't think I'm funny enough to be a Twitter maniac, but I came out of a meeting of academics in Senegal. I was referencing it earlier today. And I said, just had a great meeting, this global degree program, faculty member, what an inspiring group. And I got a tweet back from a student in northern Nigeria who told me about his experience in that program at the University of Ibadan. And I had a quick back and forth with him as I was running to an airport. We've never even conceived of how to have a real conversation globally. But if that kid in northern Nigeria, young man, can tell me about his experience and I can get the chance to listen, I'm certain that we can figure out how to build these global conversations. We just haven't done it yet. And I'm certain that if the courage of Tahrir Square can bring down one of the most ancient regimes we've ever seen, this is a problem we can solve. Inequality and its forces and the challenges of extreme poverty, environmental sustainability, everything we worry about, they're not givens. They're problems for us to solve. And ultimately, I think they're problems that our young people are going to solve for us. And that's why I believe in universities. That's why I believe in the interaction between disciplines. And that's why I'm delighted to be here with you today. Thank you very much.